Testing. Are we good? All right, so I'm going to talk about some research I've done on Carolina bays when I was working with Keith on the Savannah River Archaeology program. First, I'm going to go over what are Carolina bays, a little background on bays and bay research. Carolina Bay formation and evolution which was a big interest of mine, and many others, I think, actually. Talk about oriented lakes, other oriented lakes, which are what Carolina bays are, and then the archaeological research on bays. So what are bays? Bays are shallow, oriented elliptical depression ponds, oriented lakes that occur in large numbers throughout much of the Atlantic coastal plain. We know, approximately several hundred thousand occur between Maryland and northern Florida, with the greatest concentration in the Carolinas and Georgia. So this shows the major concentration. There are bays, further south and certainly to the north up to New Jersey. There's certainly bays in those areas as well. I like to show a lot of images. These are 3D LiDAR produced images from eastern North Carolina. So that show the major drainages and many of the Carolina bays, which I think they're just really cool to get that kind of perspective on them. So I'm going to go through a few of these. Just kind of changing the orientation. You can see the bays, mainly on the inner fluves between the drainages. Here's the beautiful bay, again in southeastern North Carolina, not far probably from Lumberton, I think. And when we got LiDAR, it just opened a whole new world. I mean, just incredible features. A lot of aeolian features, dunal features are visible around the bay rims, bays within bays, bays eroding into other bays. Lots of portions of parabolic dunes. Incredible geomorphic features that we can see. There's another angle, 3D view of that bay. These are large source bordering dunes that probably the source came out of this drainage that's through headward erosion was cutting and eating into this bay. Some of the bays you'll see actually have been drained in prehistory from streams through erosion cutting into the bays and draining the water out of the bays. Another image. This one's really cool. And again, you can see for some of these, you can see we have the windrows diagram, which shows the prevailing wind direction for many of the areas where we see the bays, which is perpendicular to the bay orientation. So with LiDAR, it's a whole different planet than looking at an aerial image, right? Just incredible features. Again, lots of dunal activity along the rims, mainly the eastern and southeastern rim. Incredible little small bays inside of these. That's just amazing to me to see that. So what are bays? Historically, they refer to as placosans, an Aboriginal term that meaning swamp on a hill. Bays have been studied periodically since they were first described scientifically in 1848 by Savage, or as Savage reported in 1982. And Carolina bays often have elevated sand rims that are composed of granular, coarse-defined sands and gravels that are formed by high-energy lacustrine, including water-lane and aeolian or wind-blown sand depositional processes. And so Carolina bays are a form of oriented lake. And oriented lakes are found at various locations globally. And so I'm going to show some examples of that. Here are oriented lakes in northern Siberia. Many of these in the Arctic regions of the globe are in areas with permafrost. So the permafrost is actually what's supporting the water, what's holding the water up in many cases. We don't have LiDAR for these. I would love to get LiDAR for these areas. Just incredible features. I mean, just the entire landscape is just covered in these oriented lakes, which you can see here have this sort of a north-south orientation. Alaska. in Texas. Well, I think they call it rainwater basins. I think maybe as a term, playa lakes, that kind of thing. Again, these are oriented. They have very similar, not all of them, but many of them have very similar shapes to what we call Carolina Bays in South Carolina. South Africa. That one, I mean, is, has a very, very similar shape and look to many of our bays, particularly the ones that actually hold water. Southeast Australia, we have these sort of lunate forms. And again, in this situation, the prevailing wind is in this direction. So you get lots of dunal formations. On this side, you get sort of a development of a sand rim. These are not as oval as the bays that we have, probably because there's probably mainly a single primary wind direction that's scouring these things out. Again, more examples of these lunates. Lake Victoria. So one of the things that I talk about quite often with people, there's an idea that's been proposed that by multiple people, and you can find it on, if you Google bays, you'll see this all day long. Did a comet create the bays? Did an fragmented asteroid hit the Earth? There's all kinds of ideas behind that. One of the most recent ideas for creation of Carolina bays was proposed in a paper in 2007 that has to do with the Younger Dryas impact, which I'm involved with and work on, which was around 13,000 years ago. We think there was a fragmented comet, kind of like that Shoemaker-Levy 9, if you remember, that hit Jupiter, right? In a series of air explosions. We think a fragmented comet hit the Earth and caused the climate event we call the Younger Dryas around 13,000 years ago. Now, some of the authors in 2007 suggested maybe the Carolina bays were related to that impact. The aftermath of the impact is hypothesized as a mechanism for explaining the Younger Dryas, the extinction of megafauna, right? The mammoth and mastodon, the demise or the decrease in the number of people, the Clovis people that were here at that time. However, I came into this very open-minded, and I'm still open-minded about lots of ideas about Carolina bays. But all the work that I've done, all the geological work and archaeological data indicate that bays started forming prior to the Younger Dryas. In many cases, much older than the Younger Dryas, and that they are the result of windblown on shore face and shore face deposited sand rather than as a result of impacts. I'm going to go into more detail on that. What conditions do you need? Well, you need a depression that will pond water, right? You need an area like we saw in the Arctic that has permafrost. You need something like we have here with humates, organics, or clays that will pond water. You need any kind of small depression that, with enough rain will pond water. If you have an aquitard, something that will keep the water from draining out. Ray Kazarowski, for his 1977 dissertation, studied circulation patterns in various oriented lakes from Alaska, Texas, South America, and Carolina bays. And what he noted is that with a strong prevailing winds, which varies from region to region, in the southeastern U.S., it's primarily out of the southwest to northeast. That's our dominant wind direction, or out of the west. And what he found is that the wind on the shallow ponded water creates circulation cells. In this way, he monitored the velocities of water and for these different types of oriented lakes, and the wind creates circulation patterns within the shallow water that scours and shapes bays into the shapes that we see. And what we see, if you look from down up, even in northern Florida, all the way up, is the orientations of the bays changed. This is the long axis orientation of the bays, right? And so this line is drawn through. You can see how, as you go increase in latitude, the long axis orientation changes. And there have been some that have suggested, well, okay, these bays orientations are all pointing to something that happened up here. There was a big impact. Some say it was on the Saginaw region. of the Great Lakes area. It ejected huge chunks of ice. I mean, there's all kinds of ideas that landed and created the bays. And so that's why these lines are lining up. That's why the long axis of the bays are lining up and change as you go further north, because they're all pointing roughly back to the same area. But if you look at the work of Carver and Brook from '89, they looked at things like parabolic dunes on our rivers as an indication of paleo wind direction. What was the dominant paleo wind direction, right? Parabolic dunes tell you that in an instant when you look at them, right? Because the U shape of the dunes are pointing basically in the direction of the wind. And so looking at riverine dunes all up and down the coastal plain of the eastern US, he was able to show that the prevailing wind patterns shifts as you move north from, Georgia, northern Florida, through South Carolina. And what we find is that the prevailing wind pattern is perpendicular to the long axis of the bays. Here we have Kozerowski's work that showed for Carolinas how Carolina bays can form from combination of winds out of the southwest and out of the west predominantly over time. Again, producing circulation cells within the water, scouring, moving sand around. You drop the water during a drought, you get wind on that, it blows the sand up on the rims, you get dunes forming. But the pattern, the orientation is driven by prevailing wind. And we see that with all oriented lakes, the ones that I showed you in the Arctic. All of those are being driven by dominant wind directions. Sometimes only one. In our case, we probably have seasonal changes out of the southwest and west that are cumulatively combining to create what we're seeing as what we recognize as Carolina Bay. And this is a schematic that I produced for a paper that I published, again, using Kozerowski's model with the circulation system here. And you can actually get scour like you have in the river channel. You can get scour on one end and deposition on another. And you can get wind reworking these shoreline deposits into what we see as the bay rims, right? The bay rims are combination of lacustrine and aeolian, right? So combination of shoreline, wave action, producing a beach, sand being blown up onto the rim. And so we actually, from this, we actually have evidence that the basins in certain areas on the coastal plain, the actual basins can migrate, like a river channel can migrate through its floodplain because it's cutting in one end and depositing in the other. In certain areas, we see the same thing going on with bays. Here's another schematic. Here we go. We got the pre-bay. This is a sort of hypothetical. We have a pre-bay depression on the coastal plain. Then you have an incipient bay formation when we have enough precipitation, we get water ponding within that depression. We have a fully formed bay. We have ponded water. We have strong glacial winds, which we know were much higher than what we have now because of all the dunes that we see. We've been able to calculate really extensive high winds common during the glacial period. And that would move a lot of sediment. If you had water in these things, if you had water in the bays, you had strong wind in the glacial period, you had very low vegetation, grassy areas, not a lot of tree cover. You can free up a lot of sediment. You can move it around. You can blow it around. You can move it around in the water itself. And so these bays are getting scoured and shaped, probably doing very specific climate events. When we have very low vegetation conditions, but we have enough precipitation to keep water. You need to have water in these basins in order to shape them. If there's no water in here in the basin, you have this last stage here, which is what we see for many bays now. They've actually filled in with peat, and they either no longer have water in them, or they maybe only have water seasonally. And of course, now with our current climate, we've got dense forest, dense vegetation. All the sediments are locked in; they're not being moved around very much. So these are basically fully formed bays we see, like Flamingo Bay, but they're inactive. And here's an example I wanted to show you from southeastern North Carolina. And this is how we know that bays were not formed instantaneously, as would be the case if it was a fragmented comet or asteroid, right? We have evidence here that several bays, the basins are actually scouring, depositing, and migrating to sort of to the northwest. And we have remnant ancient bay basins here. And as it moves in this direction, it builds a regressive sequence of bay rims. It builds that rim, it migrates more this way, it builds another rim, migrates a little bit more, it builds another rim. So these are moving. You can almost imagine these things cutting and migrating over millennia. If you could speed it up over millennia, you would see the basins actually moving, cutting through these sediments. And you can see the same thing from here. There's multiple, sort of like if you look on the LiDAR for rivers, you can see these paleo channels, right? This is a successive sequence of paleo channels. So here's the area we focused on. I went in and took a series of cores, and each of these rims here, you can see the cores we took. We took optically stimulated luminescence dating, which dates the last time that sand was exposed to sunlight. So that'll give us, we don't have in the way of radiocarbon dating. There's nothing in these sands to radiocarbon date, but we can use OSL dating to give us an idea of the age of these different rims, which I'll show that in just a minute. Here we go. And this is work that I've done, and Mark Brooks and Andrew Ivester have done in the Southeast, looking at Carolina bays. How old are they? Well, they vary. We've dated with OSL dating in the rims. We've got dates in range of 10,000 or less to over 100,000 years, and it varies significantly. And so we go to the bay rims, we'll core down to the very base of the sand rim where it's on top of the much older tertiary clay. We'll get an OSL sample from right there. So we're dating the initial formation of the bay rims, and they can vary, like I said, between 10,000 to over 100,000 years. So these are not instantaneous. They're not instantaneously formed. They're formed over long periods of time. We got Flamingo. So I'm going to go over real quickly. I'll work at Flamingo Bay that I did on the Savannah River site. Many of you probably are familiar with Flamingo. And then Frierson Bay in near Blackville. So for the archaeological work that we've done, we've brought in lots of people, lots of volunteers, lots of specialists. We've done everything from, again, the OSL dating of the sands, getting an idea how long it took the sand to get blown up on the rim. We've done magnetic susceptibility measurements, ground penetrating radar, grain size, micromorphology, soil geochemistry. Excuse me. There's Flamingo Bay, 1951 image, completely deforested. And the sand rim was they were even farming on that rim, which I can't imagine is excessively drained as that sand is on the rim. But you can actually, when we excavate at Flamingo Bay, you can find plow scars. When we dig down about 20 centimeters, you can see the plow scars in that sand. There's a LiDAR image. It shows the area. We did GPR. We put in some test units over here. We found early hunter-gatherer, early archaic, Paleo-Indian age sites that people were living on this rim, probably at a time when it held water. Seasonally does. It holds some water now, but we think probably 13,000 years ago it may have had quite a bit more water and would have been much more attractive for hunter-gatherers, for waterfowl, for turtles, maybe fish, those kind of things, especially when you're away from the river. So here's work. The Savannah River Archaeology crew is out digging at Flamingo Bay. We've got volunteers. We did work there for a number of years. There's another LiDAR image of Flamingo. And when we do when we excavate, we use a total station, a laser transit, and we shoot everything we find. Every artifact, we shoot it with a total station, right? We have the stadial rod, and we set up, so we get X, Y, Z. We have coordinates. We have three-dimensional coordinates. We know where every artifact is found. That's what this represents. This is several years of work. Numerous artifacts, including a Paleo-Indian, the base of a Paleo-Indian Clovis point that was found there. Middle Archaic points that date to around 7,500 years ago. So all of these artifacts are plotted. We've got radiocarbon dates on, and this is on charred pieces of a hickory nutshell, which I'm going to show an example of that in a minute. Another thing we find in these base sands, believe it or not, even though they're acidic, we find calcined bone. We find animal bone fragments that have been burned, probably culturally in a high temperature fire, but they weren't consumed. And it calcifies the bone and it preserves it. It makes it inert, or certainly much more so than the non-burned bone. So we find calcined bone. We had some of the bones analyzed by Tom White at Appalachian State, who's a zooarchaeologist. He identified large birds. Couldn't say which one, what kind of birds, but large birds. And the other cool thing that went along with that, when we were digging, we kept finding these little polished pebbles that, and at first I would grab them, I thought they were teeth. They looked like enamel. And, you know, at first we were just kind of ignoring them. And then we realized that they're gastroliths, they're gizzard stones that birds would take in, you know, and use in a muscle to chew up their food, right? And so we started finding these things at Flamingo Bay in large numbers. So and then we said, well, that's pretty interesting. Let's go look at birds and find out what size stones they're using. We found out you need big birds. You know, we've got stones in up to a centimeter. The only thing that we could find that had that were maybe some geese, tundra swan, sandhill crane. Alligators might, and they may even have bigger stuff than this, right? We didn't see any real big ones, but that's another possibility, right? But lots of evidence, you know, if these are coming from birds, which we think at least some of them are, because we have bird bone, which I thought was, you know, pretty cool. This is sort of an unrecognized indicator of past human activity that even for a lot of archaeologists we might not even recognize, right, at first. So that's pretty cool. We've got evidence that of mass hunting, harvesting, maybe netting of large birds and waterfowl at a Carolina Bay. And that to me suggests that was probably a common reason why these early groups were going to Carolina Bays, was to access not only the other aquatic resources, but to access, you know, what we can only imagine prehistorically what some of the bird populations would have been like, right? And just incredible. Even some of the early ethnohistoric accounts talk about massive, you know, flocks of birds and things that we just don't see anymore. So we can only imagine what they would have been seeing at 13,000 years ago. Here again, we've got one of our technicians from the Savannah River Archaeology. This is the base of the first Clovis point that was ever found in situ, buried in a Carolina Bay sand rim. So this was a 13,000-year-old point made out of an exotic material, we think maybe from North Carolina. It's what's called a green vitric tuff, or greenish argillite, which is another metamorphosed rock. First Clovis recovered in a Carolina Bay sand rim in buried context. There's been many found by collectors walking the rims that have been washed out, but this was the first one we found in place. So the Clovis period, for people who made that point, is from the period roughly 13,500 to about 12,800 years ago. Right, this was the period where we think they were possibly interacting with the last remaining megafauna from the Ice Age, mastodons, mammoths, right? Saber-toothed cats, maybe, you know, giant sloths, cave bears, you know, all incredible animals that are all extinct now. And the other interesting thing is that we have not just Clovis points, but we've got a Clovis toolkit. We've got these specialized tools, unifacial tools with spurs, flakes on blades, spoke shaves, that we think are used in the production of hafts and shafts for the points, right? This is the thing that we don't find. This is all gone, this is rotted away long ago. We never find this, right? But this was the major technological component, because a Clovis point would have been hafted in a foreshaft, wrapped with animal sinew, pine pitch to half the point. And then that foreshaft would have been inserted into a longer spear that would have been thrown as an atlatl, right? So they weren't throwing these with their hand. They inserted them into an atlatl spear thrower and were throwing right? And so they could throw it into an animal, pull the spear out, take another force shaft with a close point on it and reload, right? Stick it back in there and they were ready to go again. So this was an advanced technology. Most of that is gone. But what we find is the stone evidence of the production of that technology. Right. So, and again, we think that we have imaginations of Clovis people interacting with, hunting, large mammoths and mastodons that lived at that time. We know we found evidence out west that they'd done that, certainly. But you can imagine this is pretty dangerous activity. I'm not sure I would want to do that. This guy's having a bad day. He's getting stomped. So very dangerous activity, but we know they hunted them. And I'm getting ready to publish a paper just coming out in a few months. It's going to show even more evidence that they were hunting these animals in South Carolina. So stay tuned for that. But it's hard to imagine some form or fashion, either, culturally or part of their, they sent people out to actually hunt these animals. And we know out west, they would run them off cliffs, right? They would hide and scare them and actually run them off of a cliff. We don't have as much of that out here. But you do wonder how much of this is reality. Were they really engaging these animals point blank? I don't know, but certainly they were hunting them. So in 2013, with that in mind, I decided to do something called blood residue analysis. It's an immunological technique to extract ancient proteins out of cracks in the stone tool. And so it's been done before in other parts of the US. And so I said, let's try it here. And we went in, we excavated at Flamingo Bay. This is the rim at Flamingo Bay. And I said, we don't want to touch these things like we normally would, right? We find something, we map it in, we draw it, photograph it, but then we grab it. I didn't want to contaminate it. We didn't want to touch it. We didn't want to wash anything. So we excavated all these tools. We did a blood residue analysis, this immunological technique. And we had a number of tools that came back positive for blood residue. The first one we got, here we have one of our technicians, she's carefully holding this large spear point bifacial knife on a bag, on a plastic bag. Came back with evidence of bison or bovine. So that was the first, okay, aha moment that maybe we had a really interesting way of getting at what animals these people were hunting at 13,000 years ago. And I will say it's hard to understand. It's not DNA. It's a protein residue that gets through capillary uptake, it gets absorbed into microscopic fractures in the stone. When they flake the stone and make a stone tool, it produces fractures. And when they use it, the blood goes into those fractures. And there's some remnant of protein in there that's outside of my area of expertise. But that protein actually can provide a positive reaction when it's tested against modern antisera, like they would for something like this. And this could be Bison antiquus, the large species of bison that existed at the end of the Ice Age. We can't tell that, but we know it's bovid or bison. And so they will test it using modern bison antibodies extracted from the blood of those bison to test it against what we find in the stone tools. All right, so jumping over to Frierson Bay and Barnwell County, we did work on the rim, a beautiful sand rim here along the bay, and had some smaller sort of Carolina Bay-like depressions on the east side of the rim. Here's again another picture of Frierson Bay. We did, Keith talked about shovel tests. We did shovel tests all down the rim. We located areas of we have archaeological sites, a lot of high density of artifacts. We went in and placed test units. This is a GIS modeled elevation map showing the rim. Here we are with volunteers and with SREL archaeologists. Some of you may recognize some of the folks on here, Rooney Floyd and others, but they would come out, we would excavate the site. And this is one interesting feature from Frierson Bay. we came down, we excavated down and found this incredible buried cache of chert bifaces, chert tools and bifaces. Some of these are probably preforms. In other words, they weren't finished. They went to the quarries in Allendale, knocked out some bifaces and brought them in a bag, probably an animal skin bag. And they got buried in the rim and have been there for millennia. So we found them in place. Here they are. There's some that have been worked almost into finished tools, finished spear points. Others are just pieces of chert that have been knocked off. And the interesting thing about this is that some of these had river cortex on them. In other words, they'd been in a river long enough to develop a patina from the the organic, the acids in the water and that kind of thing. And what we found is that these were tools, these were recycled tools. These were pieces of chert that were flaked in prehistory, wound up in a river, developed a patina, and then were pulled out and flaked again before winding up at Frierson Bay. So we've got ancient flaking with river cortex, and we've got recent flaking where all the river cortex is removed. So this is ancient recycling that's going on, right? So at Frierson Bay, they're not next to the quarries, right? So they're gonna recycle they're gonna recycle chert if they have to, rather than having to go all the way down to the Savannah River to get more chert. And I think that's what we're seeing here as evidence of recycling. We also have a nice sandstone abrader up here that we got in this, all part of the cache. Here we are taking a sediment column where we do granulometry or sedimentology out of the unit. This is the completed test unit. The cache came from right in here. We go in and do, here's the map feature, the cache. We take samples for luminescence dating. Again, these are, 7,000, 6,400, 4,000 years ago. We graph the numbers of artifacts by level. We look at, lots, all kinds of things. And so, but the OSL dating told us that this cache is probably produced during either the very end of the middle Archaic or late Archaic time frame. Another cool thing I like to show, we find in every sand rim that we dig are fulgurites. We find tiny pieces of fulgurites, not big ones, but small pieces of fulgurites that at first we didn't know what we were looking at. But these are where lightning strikes the sand rim, right? It fuses the sand together, it produces these little tubes, right? They're not cultural, obviously, but it's something I like to show because it's kind of a neat thing to find in these sand rims. I know at places like Jockey's Ridge and in North Carolina, right on the Outer Banks, they find huge fulgurites in the dune there. We haven't found that, but we have small pieces of fulgurites. Here are some more tools from Frierson Bay. We've got quartz points, metavolcanic tools. Again, this is 10,000-year-old point. This is about 8,000-year-old. We've got stuff into the woodland period. They're only a few thousand years old. We've got sandstone abraders. We've got all kinds of tools. If they're lithics, they survive. If they're organic, we don't find it in the Carolina Bays, with one exception, and that is if you look at many of the sites. This is when we screen all the material through a 1/4-inch screen or 1/8-inch screen. We keep everything in the screen, right? Everything that doesn't fall through, we keep it. We wash it, and at this site and others, we've got charred hickory nut. We think it's hickory nut that's been burned in a fire. They probably smashed it, processed it. The shell was burned. When you burn hickory nut, it's inert. We've dated some of this material as old as 11,000 years old. It looks like chart. It looks like something you could pull out your fire yesterday. And we've got multiple dates of 7,500, 8,000 years on pieces of charred hickory nut. One of the few things that's left in bay rims that we can date that we think is probably directly tied to people living there and processing hickory nuts for food. I'm about to wrap up, but here's the work from Flamingo, Frierson, and then another bay in Allendale. These are OSL dates that we were able to gather all the way back 13,000. We got a somewhat of a reversal here. 11,000, 9,200, 5,000. Right, so we've developed a chronology with OSL in cases where we don't have radiocarbon. Radiocarbon is a lot better if you can get radiocarbon. If you can't, you can use OSL. Well, we got dates of 87,000, 35,000, was 39, 34, 40,000 years for these particular bays for their initial formation of those sand rims. And then these are the artifacts, right? Including Paleo-Indian, Clovis, all the way up through the Woodland and Mississippian period. So what have we learned about bays in all this time? We've learned that geologic dating shows that bays are older. Many of them are older than 100,000 years, with periods of more recent activation, such as the bay where the basin migrated and you get more rims being formed that are younger. They're formed by natural processes involving strong glacial winds on shallow ponded water rather than an extraterrestrial impact of a comet or asteroid. And the origin of the initial depression is secondary, since Carolina bays are dynamic, evolving geomorphic features. Any low depression or dune blowout would suffice, giving appropriate hydrological and climatological thresholds to create and start forming a bay through the processes that I've gone over. And lastly, as we've seen, they contain valuable cultural, paleoenvironmental data, including data on climate change, human adaptation in the coastal plain. Thank you. Any questions?
Yes.
Sorry.
I guess, given the landscape, a lot of these bays rim it out, most of them are inert at this
Right.
time. Is there any evidence that, were they active even a couple hundred years ago? Would that coincide like with a longleaf savanna ecosystem or something?
I mean, there may be areas where that happened. I think certainly in the areas where I mainly look, like the Paleo-Indian time period, when we find 13,000-year-old artifacts or 10,000-year-old artifacts, and many of these rims are buried about a meter deep. So there's been a meter of deposition in that 13 or 10,000 years. And we think that probably represents periods of drought. Maybe if you have fire events that burn the vegetation, free the sand up, you know, maybe you have to lower the water, and you can have winds that can blow that sand gradually over millennia and build these rims. But most of the activity, the formation, the shaping and orientation, we think that happened, is 30, 40,000 years ago or more, when we had very different climatic conditions, much less vegetation on the landscape and much stronger winds. So, that answer.
Is there any evidence that there's water from the groundwater that comes into the space, or is that entirely from atmospheric sources?
There's probably some of that. I know at White Pond, there are springs, I've heard, that the owners claim can feed that, water into that system, but
It's not the exception.
I think so. I think it is primarily, in the coastal plain. I think most of it is derived from rainwater.
With your OSL measurements,
Mhm.
is that good for like a plus or minus a million years? Is that kind of less than you have, or you have better? Is it less than?
No, OSL is good for about back to around 150,000.
50? Oh,
Yeah, 150,000. But you may have noticed, even for you may get a 13,000-year OSL date, but the error will be a couple thousand years. So it's not, radiocarbon date. You might get a 13,000-year-old day. Your segment will be 25 years, 50 years maybe. So radiocarbon dates are much more precise. But in the absence of those, the OSL is good for ballpark, figuring out the relative age of these sand deposits. And that goes for sand dunes. There's been a lot of OSL done on sand dunes throughout the Southeast. Andrew Ivester, David Lee, people like that have done that.
is that a spectrophotometric method, or is it a radiological?
They take you have to collect the sample without exposing it to light. So you use a tube, an opaque tube, you drive it into the profile, cap it off, take it out, they take it into a dark room and they isolate the grains. And so what they're measuring is the natural uranium and thorium at very low levels that's everywhere. It's the sand grains, if they're exposed during deposition, when these rims are building, it releases all the required dose. And after they're buried, the silica structure of those sand grains starts accumulating a dose from the natural radiation. And so if they can take that into a lab without exposing it, they can cause it to luminesce, measure the dose as a function of time of burial. So they know how much radiation, they measure the background radiation, then they measure the luminescence off the sand grain, and they can say, okay, well, this grain has been buried for 10,000 years because it's given off this much energy.
So if, say, a nuclear plant is built on a sandy area, I imagine that would mess with your ability to use those stuff.
Yeah, you probably don't want to get OSL next to a reactor, but yeah, I don't know. That's a good question.
How difficult is it to find bays that are relatively unmolested, like the past 200 years of the activity, so you can answer the questions you're asking?
It's pretty hard. Most of them have been. But even so, many, if the rims are intact and they haven't been, people go in and create sand pits and use the sand. If they haven't done that, then there's a chance that we've got an intact sequence, of prehistory that could be in those sand rims. So, and many of them, as I was discussing earlier with the grad students, historically, they drain or they attempted to drain many of the bays. I think the one in Blackville, I heard there's a story, they cut ditches and through the rims to drain them to farm to farm inside the basin or to have cattle. And they drained this one that had water and it washed the railroad out. It came out catastrophically. And I've seen other cases where they gave up. They started a ditch and they realized they were going to have to dig it so deep, they just stopped. Thankfully, that's Johns Bay, is a beautiful bay in Allendale. It has water in it, beautiful. And there's White Pond in Elgin. There's one there that gave up on. They tried to drain it a number of years ago. So, but yeah, the lot of them have been affected by historic activities. Yeah.
John's Bay, the one you said they water ski on it.
They water skied on it, is what I heard, or maybe even have boat races. I mean, it's not really that big. I get it's big enough, I guess, but it's a beautiful bay. Yeah.
All those ditches, of course, we look at that in our human time period, and we know that they destroyed what we're interested in.
Yeah,
here in
right.
terms of plant and animal life there.
Right.
What you're telling me is, at some point in the future, they may rebuild themselves.
Yeah.
We're not in the picture.
Oh, absolutely. If we go back into despite global warming, anthropogenic warming were happening, eventually we probably will still go back into an ice age. And we cut down vegetation like we had 20,000 years ago. If you have a massive ice sheet over North America, several hundred kilometers to our north, you're going to produce these pressure gradients, which cause massive wind. So you have very little vegetation and massive wind, including directional winds, that's going to reactivate those bays. Absolutely.
Chris, speaking to the Flamingo Bay, zones of occupation, what do you see, so the woodland folks are down closer to the modern day basin, or you find them up on the rim of the paleo folks, or what is the distribution?
At Flamingo Bay, we have identified multiple sites on the rims. The area where I worked had a little bit of everything. And Flamingo doesn't have multiple rims like some. The one in North Carolina that I looked at that had the beautiful multiple rims, we had a hell of a time finding anything there. I just thought it would be eat up with archaeology, but I think in parts of southeastern North Carolina, there were so many Carolina bays. I think Native Americans probably only went to certain ones. And the ones that had water prehistorically are the ones that probably would have been targeted. So that's the lack of archaeology at that bay tells me it probably, it's empty now. It doesn't have water now. And it was never drained, at least not by humans. And so that's probably why it doesn't have any archaeology. There's so many bays in that area. And Flamingo Bay and some of the others we worked on, Johns Bay, many of them were probably areas where Native American trails interacted. When they were moving in the uplands or the interstream divides, Native Americans were following game trails that were produced by megafauna probably for millennia, mastodons and mammoths, bison. So they followed the game trails, and where they intersected regions that had bays, I'm sure they were being used quite a bit. In other areas, probably not so much. I'm gonna go to the back of the
That answer, but how many of the days or what percent of the days on site have y'all looked at and you have to sense if there's others like them in there?
There was Mark Brooks did a bay survey a number of years ago. I don't remember exactly how many they looked at. There's certainly nowhere near the majority.
I'd say maybe a dozen.
Yeah, that probably makes sense.
And only flamingos so far. And only flamingos so far has signs of occupation.
No, probably almost everyone that we've shovel tested has some evidence of occupation. Yeah. Who else? Oh, no, go ahead.
Differences in bay formation, like the lower coastal plain, is obviously very standard versus the upper coastal plain where you get more clay components. Is the formation different, or is the shape different? Does it take longer, or does it not matter?
I know the areas where I've seen, like in North Carolina, the bays that appear to have migrated, you don't see that everywhere. I think you see that in areas on the coastal plain where you have a more gentle slope. And that's just, that's just a theory I have right now. But you only see the migration going on in certain areas. And I haven't really quantified it, but most bays, they certainly are building these sand rims over time. Most of them don't have multiple rims. The ones that I see that in certain areas of North Carolina and South Carolina, and I'm just guessing maybe they have a more gradual slope that allows those basins to slowly move and migrate over time. But I really don't know the answer to that. Great.
Well, I do want to thank both of you for coming, and please stay if you have questions, because it sounds like there's a lot of interest. I just didn't want to.
Sure.
And thank you for your patience.
Great. Thank you. Mhm.
And please give them a Never seen that little,
Yeah, that's what I was using.
Yeah.
Over there.
Just a second. Yeah, that was not on there before.
Yeah.
Oh, let me stop the recording.